Family truths are rarely questioned. We accept the stories we're told, the roles we're given, the framed photographs on the walls as an untouchable narrative, until something completely shatters it. "Audrey, sweetheart, there's something I need to tell you," said my mother, Catherine Mitchell, 1 week after my father's funeral. We were sitting in the library of our family mansion in Boston, the space my father had occupied for decades as his personal retreat. "Your father wanted to protect you from the truth, but now that he's gone, I feel it's my duty to be honest." Her artificially solemn tone had already set off internal alarms, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. "You're not biologically our daughter. We adopted you when you were a baby." The statement hung in the air like toxic smoke. 32 years of identity crumbled in a single sentence. I stared at the elegant 58-year-old woman who had always been emotionally distant, yet undeniably my mother, searching for signs that this was some kind of cruel joke. "That's why your name doesn't appear specifically in your father's will," she continued, avoiding my gaze. "Legally, you're not entitled to the Mitchell inheritance." The Mitchell inheritance. $75 million that, according to the shockingly revised will read just hours earlier, would be divided between my half-brother Vincent and several charities, with a portion reserved for my mother to be distributed upon her death. No direct mention of me, the daughter who grew up in this house, who shared my father's love for literature, who chose a modest academic career over the family business to follow her own passion. "I need proof," I finally managed to say, my voice firmer than I expected. "Certificates, adoption papers, anything." "Unfortunately, your father was discreet about it. It was a different time, you must understand. Adoptions weren't as formal and open as they are now." As I watched her evasive eyes and perfectly manicured hands nervously adjusting the pearl on her necklace, an inner voice I rarely ignored, the same one that made me a meticulous scholar, whispered an undeniable truth. She was lying. The question was, why? Harold Mitchell built his real estate empire with the same methodical precision he used to organize his library, each acquisition strategic, each development planned for maximum efficiency. He was a man of spreadsheets and punctuality, of airtight contracts and crystal-clear expectations. Our relationship, while never warm like those in sentimental movies, was rooted in mutual respect. He valued my academic dedication as a university literature professor just as much as Vincent's business inclinations. Vincent, my half-brother from my father's first marriage. "Different kinds of excellence," he used to say. Unlike many tycoons, my father never pressured his children to follow in his footsteps. Instead, he insisted only on rigor and integrity in whatever path we chose. "Fortune can be inherited. Reputation must be earned," was one of his favorite sayings. Replaying our interactions over the 32 years of my life, I couldn't find anything to suggest I wasn't his biological daughter. On the contrary, he often remarked how I had inherited his stubbornness and strategic vision, while my love for art and literature came from the artistic side of the family, usually with a meaningful glance toward my Aunt Eleanor, his younger sister. The adoption story simply didn't align with the meticulous accuracy that defined my father in every aspect of life. Harold Mitchell, the man who kept detailed records of every financial transaction since his first venture, would have ensured any adoption was legally airtight and beyond dispute. After that unsettling conversation with my mother, I retreated to my apartment near the university where I taught. In the days that followed, I went through every family photograph I owned, now examining them with a critical eye for any inconsistencies. There were images of Catherine pregnant, looking genuinely radiant, a rare sight for a woman usually, so controlled in her public appearance. There were photos of me as a newborn in both their arms at the hospital. Records of every stage of my childhood development were meticulously cataloged in the baby book I discovered in a box of old belongings. If it was all an elaborate forgery, the effort would have been extraordinary. And for what purpose, if they eventually planned to reveal the truth? After a week of interrupted sleep and impaired focus in my lectures, I decided to seek out the one member of the Mitchell family who had always shown me genuine affection: my Aunt Eleanor. Unlike the rest of the status-driven family, Eleanor had chosen a career in medicine, initially working in public health before establishing a private practice. Now retired at 62, she lived in a quaint cottage on the outskirts of Boston, modest, by Mitchell standards, but perfectly suited to her tastes. I arrived unannounced on a Saturday afternoon and found her in her meticulously kept garden. When she saw me, her face lit up with the warm smile she reserved just for me until she registered the troubled look on my face. "Audrey, sweetheart, what happened?" When I shared my mother's revelation, Eleanor's reaction was immediate and unequivocal. "Adopted? That's utterly ridiculous." Her indignation was palpable. "I was literally in the delivery room when you were born. I held you at the hospital minutes later." "Then why would she say that?" I asked, relief and confusion battling for dominance. Eleanor sighed deeply, guiding me to a shaded bench in the garden. "Your mother has always had a complicated relationship with money and status. Her marriage to your father was more of an arrangement than a romance. She brought the social connections Harold needed early in his career. He provided the financial security she valued above all else. Do you think she's trying to manipulate the inheritance situation?" The question sounded absurd as I said it out loud, even considering my often strained relationship with my mother. "Harold mentioned in recent weeks that he was worried about your mother's spending habits," Eleanor revealed hesitantly. "Since his diagnosis, she's apparently started a pattern of extravagant purchases, as if she were preparing for a lifestyle she might not be able to maintain if the will split everything equally." "And Vincent?" "Vincent always admired your father, but unfortunately, he inherited more of his strategic mind than his moral compass. He and Catherine have grown closer in recent years in a way I've never fully understood." Before I left, Eleanor went to an old oak cabinet in her study. "Harold entrusted this box to me a few months ago. He said it was a kind of insurance in case something happened before he could finalize his plans." The box contained several carefully organized documents: old family photographs, letters, and, most critically, a draft of a will dated just 5 weeks before my father's death. In this document, he clearly named me as the primary heir to 40% of his estate, with smaller distributions going to Vincent, Catherine, and several charitable institutions. "This draft is several weeks more recent than the official will that was submitted," I noted, the implication becoming clear to both of us. "Your father was fully in control of his mental faculties until about 3 weeks before the end," Eleanor confirmed, her professional doctor's tone blending with personal concern. "After that, the pain medication often left him disoriented." I left Eleanor's house with two certainties: I wasn't adopted, and someone had deliberately manipulated my father's final will while he was incapacitated. The issue now wasn't just about reclaiming my identity, but about honoring my father's true final intentions. The box of documents sitting on the passenger seat of my car felt like both a promise and a burden. If the draft will showed my father's original intent, the officially recorded document pointed to deliberate and possibly criminal manipulation. I needed more than suspicions and a draft. I needed indisputable evidence. Heading back to my apartment, I made a call to Thomas Reed, a childhood friend who had become a probate attorney. Ever since we played together at Boston Society events our parents attended, Thomas had always shown a combination of sharp insight and unwavering integrity, qualities that made him the perfect ally for this situation. "A fraudulent will accusation is extremely serious," Thomas explained after hearing my story. "We need to be absolutely meticulous." What if I could conclusively prove I'm not adopted? Wouldn't that show my mother is lying about something fundamental? It would be a start, certainly, but how would you prove it? The answer came like a flash. DNA test. If I'm the biological daughter of Harold and Catherine Mitchell, modern science can confirm that beyond any doubt. The next morning, after careful research, I scheduled an appointment with Dr. Sophia Patel from the Family Genomics Institute. With impressive credentials and a reputation for absolute discretion, she was the ideal specialist for something as sensitive as challenging parentage in one of Boston's most prominent families. In cases like yours, I recommend a comprehensive ancestry and kinship test. Dr. Patel explained in her immaculate office. It not only confirms direct parent-child relationships, but also maps out connections to extended relatives, giving a complete picture of the genetic lineage. And what would I need to take the test? Ideally, DNA samples from all parties involved, you, your mother, and a viable sample from your deceased father. That last requirement presented an obvious challenge. How do you obtain DNA from someone who had been dead for 8 months? Personal items often retain viable genetic material, Dr. Patel said, answering my unspoken question. Hairbrushes, old razors, even sealed correspondence can contain recoverable DNA. Aunt Eleanor once again proved invaluable, providing a hairbrush my father kept at her house for frequent visits. My own sample was, of course, easy to obtain. The real challenge would be collecting DNA from my mother without raising suspicion. The opportunity came when Catherine, maintaining her social image, invited me to lunch at Rosewood, her favorite restaurant in Boston. During the extremely tense meal, where she alternated between superficial questions about my job and selective memories of my father, I discreetly slipped her used napkin into my purse while she stepped away briefly. As the samples were being processed at the lab, Thomas and I meticulously examined the documents from my father's box. In addition to the draft will, we uncovered something equally disturbing: evidence of significant financial transfers from my father's personal accounts to an offshore entity in the Cayman Islands during the final months of his life. These transfers line up exactly with the period when your father started needing stronger pain medication, Thomas noted, connecting dates on a timeline we were building. And the final beneficiary appears to be a holding company linked to Vincent Mitchell. Was my half-brother draining assets even before the will was executed? The implication was shocking, even considering the always distant relationship with Vincent. Thomas nodded gravely. And if these transfers happened without your father's explicit and informed consent while he was incapacitated, we're no longer dealing with a probate dispute, we're potentially dealing with financial crime. The complexity of the situation was escalating quickly. I wasn't just defending my identity and rightful inheritance. I might be exposing financial fraud within my own family. 2 weeks later, I got a call from Dr. Patel. Her normally calm voice carried an unusual tone I couldn't quite identify. Miss Mitchell, we have the results of your family DNA test. However, I'd prefer not to discuss them over the phone. Would you be able to come to the lab tomorrow? Are the results that bad? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. A significant pause. They're not bad, Audrey. They're unexpected. Extremely unexpected. Dr. Patel's lab occupied the top floor of a discreet building in Cambridge, its glass walls and cutting-edge equipment contrasting with the historic brick facade. She greeted me personally at the front desk and led me not to her office, but to a private conference room. I prefer to show the results visually, she explained, opening a laptop. Some conclusions are easier to grasp when seen directly. On the screen, she first displayed a simple diagram of genetic markers. We started by confirming what you already suspected. There's no evidence of adoption. You are definitely the biological daughter of Harold Mitchell, she pointed to a series of highlighted matches between my DNA and the hairbrush sample. The paternal match is undeniable, 99.9998% certainty. A wave of initial relief swept over me, immediately followed by the realization that Dr. Patel didn't seem entirely satisfied with this confirmation. Clearly, there was more. What? About my mother? I asked, bracing for further confirmation that would expose Catherine's lie. The geneticist hesitated briefly, adjusting her thin-framed glasses. Here's the unexpected result, Audrey. We found no maternal match with Catherine Mitchell. 0 significant genetic correspondence. What? The word slipped out as a confused whisper. If I'm not adopted, but Catherine isn't my biological mother, then who? There's more, she continued, moving to another chart. As part of our standard protocol, we compared your DNA with all submitted samples. We identified the expected half-sibling match with Vincent Mitchell, consistent with you sharing the same father. I nodded mechanically, still trying to process the first revelation. However, we also found another extremely strong match. She pointed to an astonishing overlap of genetic markers between my DNA and another sample. between you and Eleanor Carson." "My aunt?" The confusion deepened. "It's normal to have a significant match with a paternal aunt, right?" "Not to this degree, Audrey. This is not a niece-aunt match." Her eyes met mine, gentle, yet direct. "Genetically, Eleanor Carson shows markers consistent with biological motherhood. Put simply, the tests indicate that Eleanor is your biological mother." The world seemed momentarily suspended. The words hung in the air like impossible particles, refusing to settle into any logical configuration. Eleanor, my beloved aunt, my father's sister, my biological mother? There must be some mistake, I finally managed to say. Eleanor is my father's sister. We repeated the tests 3 times using different protocols. The results are conclusive. Dr. Patel now spoke with a studied gentleness. "I understand this is deeply unsettling." My hands trembled slightly as I tried to organize my whirlwind of thoughts. Fragments of memories resurfaced with new meaning. The special affection Eleanor had always shown me. Her occasional comments about how I had inherited the family's artistic side. Something neither Catherine nor Harold had. The way she always appeared at crucial moments in my life. That would mean... I hesitated, the inevitable. Conclusion forming reluctantly. "I can't and shouldn't speculate on personal circumstances beyond the scientific data," Dr. Patel replied diplomatically. "The results only establish biological relationships. They don't explain how they came to be." I left the lab in a state of functional shock, driving automatically through familiar streets that now felt like part of an alternate reality. In the empty parking lot of a park, I finally allowed the tears to fall, not from sadness or anger, but from sheer emotional overload. Eleanor, Harold, siblings by blood, parents by blood. The phone interrupted my existential crisis. It was, "Thomas. Audrey, I found something significant about those offshore transfers. We need to talk immediately." We met in his office 30 minutes later. Part of me wanted to share the shocking DNA revelation right away, but another part, more pragmatic, needed to first fully understand the legal situation we were facing. I managed to trace the transfers through 3 layers of shell companies, Thomas explained, spreading out meticulously organized documents. "They definitely end in an account controlled by Vincent. More concerning, I found medical records from the same time period showing your father was frequently under the influence of medications that severely impaired his decision-making ability. So Vincent potentially committed fraud or extortion, at the very least, he took advantage of someone vulnerable. Combined with the suspicious will, we have enough grounds for a formal challenge and possibly a criminal investigation." I remained silent for a few moments, considering how the new information about my origins further complicated everything. "Thomas, I need to tell you something that will significantly change our approach." I took a deep breath. The DNA test revealed that Eleanor Carson, supposedly my aunt, is actually my biological mother. His face registered a sequence of emotions, shock, confusion, and finally, the professional comprehension of the legal implications. "This considerably complicates the inheritance situation," he said at last. "If you're biologically the child of Harold and Eleanor, who are siblings, my legal position as heir could be questioned due to the nature of my biological parents' relationship," I finished, the reality of the situation crystallizing with painful clarity. Thomas nodded slowly. "We need to talk to Eleanor immediately. Before taking any legal action, we need to fully understand this story." On the way to Eleanor's cottage, countless possibilities tormented my mind. Had it been a consensual relationship, kept secret, due to social conventions, something more sinister, or perhaps a medical explanation we had never considered? Eleanor was waiting for us on the porch, as if she had sensed our arrival. Her face, usually serene, now bore lines of worry. "You found?" "Out," she said simply as I stepped out of the car. It wasn't a question. Eleanor's porch, with its weathered wicker chairs and pots overflowing with geraniums, had always felt like a haven of simplicity in contrast to the calculated opulence of the Mitchell estate. Now it became the stage for revelations that would completely redefine my understanding of family, identity, and legacy. I assume you did a DNA test, Eleanor remarked as we sat down, pouring tea into old china cups as if we were there for an ordinary social visit, not about to uncover devastating family secrets. Yes. The simplicity of the answer felt inadequate for the complexity of the situation. Eleanor, I need to know the whole truth. She nodded slowly, setting her teacup down on the side table with meticulous care. For several moments, she simply gazed at the carefully maintained garden, as if searching for courage among the orderly flowers. Harold and I didn't grow up together, she began at last. Our parents divorced when we were very young. He was 7 and I was just 4. Our father took Harold to Chicago, while I stayed with our mother in Seattle. It was a bitter split, and the two sides of the family lost all contact. The story that unfolded felt like something out of a Victorian novel. The estranged siblings reconnected only in adulthood, when Eleanor, then a medical student in her 20s, met Harold, an up-and-coming real estate entrepreneur, at a charity conference. Unaware of their blood relation due to their different last names, she had taken her stepfather's name, they developed a romantic connection. When we discovered the truth about our relationship, we were already deeply involved, Eleanor explained, silent tears streaming down her face. And I was already pregnant with you. The shock of the revelation was softened only by the grace with which Eleanor shared this painful truth. Thomas, maintaining his professional composure, remained silently attentive, occasionally taking discreet notes. Why didn't anyone tell me? I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. Why this elaborate lie for 32 years? It was a different time, Audrey. A scandal of this magnitude would have destroyed not only our personal reputations, but also Harold's emerging empire. The solution we came up with seemed like the only viable one. Catherine, newly married to Harold and desperate for social status, had agreed to an extraordinary arrangement. She would pretend to be pregnant, give birth to the child who was actually Eleanor's, and raise the baby as her own in exchange for lifelong financial security. Eleanor would be introduced to society as Harold's sister, allowing her to remain close to her biological daughter, even if only as a loving aunt. You were the daughter I could never publicly acknowledge. Eleanor confessed, her voice trembling. Watching you grow up from a distance, confined to the role of an aunt, was both my greatest joy and my deepest sorrow. The pieces of the puzzle were fitting together with painful clarity. Catherine's emotional distance, the special bond I had always felt with Eleanor. My father's careful efforts to secure my future despite the formally reserved nature of our relationship. Your father always planned to reveal the truth eventually, Eleanor continued, especially after his terminal diagnosis. The draft of the will you found was part of that plan, to ensure you would be recognized as his legitimate daughter, regardless of the circumstances of your birth. Thomas, breaking his contemplative silence, brought up the inevitable practical question. So Catherine knew Audrey wasn't adopted, but was in fact the biological daughter of Harold and you? That means her recent claim was deliberately misleading. Catherine always knew the full truth, Eleanor confirmed. The agreement we made guaranteed her financial security in exchange for maintaining the illusion. I assume she saw an opportunity when Harold's health declined, a chance to renegotiate the terms, so to speak. The moral and legal complexity of the situation was extraordinary. If I contested the current will, I would inevitably expose the family secret my father apparently intended to reveal on his own terms. If I stayed silent, I would allow Catherine and Vincent to benefit through manipulation and potential fraud. We need a strategy that balances truth and discretion, Thomas said after careful consideration. Something that honors your father's intentions without necessarily exposing every detail of your birth circumstances to the public. In the weeks that followed, we worked diligently to build our case. Thomas obtained testimony from the doctor who had cared for my father during his final months, confirming that Harold had frequently been under the influence of powerful pain medications at the time the revised will was allegedly signed. Eleanor provided years of correspondence between her and Harold which, though discreet, clearly established his intent to secure my financial future and acknowledge my rightful place in the family. She also meticulously documented the timeline of Catherine's pregnancy, including details that could potentially prove its falsehood. By analyzing financial records made available through documents my father had entrusted to Eleanor, we established a clear pattern of suspicious transfers coinciding with the period of Harold's greatest vulnerability. Thomas discreetly consulted a prosecutor specializing in financial crimes, who confirmed we had sufficient evidence to justify a formal investigation. We don't necessarily need to initiate criminal proceedings right away, Thomas explained during our final strategics meeting. The mere possibility may offer significant leverage for negotiation. We agreed on a carefully calibrated approach. We would schedule a formal meeting at the Mitchell estate, requesting the presence of Catherine, Vincent, and their respective attorneys to discuss inheritance-related matters. We would not disclose our findings in advance, allowing us to control the narrative and observe their unfiltered reactions. On the eve of that crucial confrontation, I visited the cemetery, where my father was buried. The simple marble headstone stood in stark contrast to the grandeur that had defined his public life. "I don't know if I'm doing what you would have done," I murmured into the respectful silence around me. "But I'm doing what I believe is right, honoring your true intentions, not the ones that were manipulated during your most vulnerable hours." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the nearby trees, neither confirmation nor denial, just a quiet reminder that some answers must be found within ourselves. That night, I mentally reviewed every detail of our plan. Thomas would begin by presenting evidence of the altered will and the suspicious transfers, elements that, on their own, would justify legal contestation. Only after Catherine and Vincent grasped the strength of our position would I reveal the full truth about my origins, then offer a private settlement as an alternative to a prolonged public battle that would inevitably expose painful family secrets. It was a strategy aimed at justice without revenge, truth without unnecessary humiliation. As the sun rose the next morning, I prepared myself to finally confront those who had tried to deny not just my financial inheritance, but my very identity. The Mitchell estate still carried that distinctive atmosphere found in homes inhabited by generations of the same family. Layers of history accumulated like varnish over old furniture. I arrived precisely at 10 o'clock as agreed, finding Thomas already waiting at the circular driveway. "Ready?" he asked, his professional tone tinged ever so slightly with personal concern. "As ready as I can be," I replied, adjusting the folder that held our meticulously organized documents, our ammunition for the battle ahead. The housekeeper, Martha, someone I had known since childhood, led us to the library, the room that had always been my father's domain. I immediately noticed small changes. The classic literature books that once filled the central shelf had been replaced with decorative volumes, their bindings perfectly matching the room's color scheme. It was a small detail, but symbolically significant. Harold would never have rearranged his beloved books for the sake of aesthetics. Catherine was already waiting for us, impeccably dressed in a navy Chanel suit. Her attorney, Philip Hargrove, a seasoned and feared veteran in will, disputes by her side. Vincent arrived moments later, accompanied by his own legal representation. "Audrey, dear," Catherine greeted me with that artificial smile that never reached her eyes. "Is this meeting really necessary? Family matters can become so unpleasant when formalized like this." "I'm afraid formality is essential, given the circumstances," Thomas replied on my behalf, immediately adopting the professional tone that set the tone for the entire meeting. We sat around the imposing oak table where my father used to review contracts. The irony was not lost on me. The same space where he had built his empire would now be used to challenge the manipulation of his final legacy. Thomas began methodically, first laying out the timeline of events, Harold's terminal diagnosis, the progressive deterioration of his health, and the critical dates related to the altered will. "We'd like to draw your attention to this medical documentation," Thomas continued, distributing neatly organized folders. "It confirms that on the dates the currently recognized will was supposedly reviewed and signed, Harold Mitchell was under medication that significantly impaired his decision-making capacity." Hargrove. Catherine's attorney flipped through the documents with an expressionless face. "These are serious allegations, Mr. Reed. However, the will was properly witnessed and notarized by witnesses who, interestingly, have direct ties to Mr. Vincent Mitchell," Thomas countered, revealing our next layer of evidence, including his personal assistant and private accountant. Vincent shifted slightly in his chair, the first sign of discomfort. Catherine remained still, only a slight tremor in her hand betraying any reaction. "Furthermore," Thomas continued, "we've identified a troubling pattern of financial transfers from Harold Mitchell's personal accounts to offshore entities recently controlled by Mr. Vincent Mitchell. These transfers occurred precisely during the period of Mr. Mitchell's most severe medical vulnerability." The atmosphere in the room changed perceptibly. Vincent's lawyer leaned in to whisper urgently in his ear. Catherine cast a barely perceptible glance toward her son, a mix of alarm and warning. "Those transactions were completely legitimate," Vincent protested, ignoring his lawyer's silent advice to remain quiet. "Investments my father personally approved. Curious that there's no proper documentation for those investments," Thomas noted. "And even more curious that they took place at a time when medical records show your father was frequently under the influence of morphine," Catherine interjected, her voice taking on that carefully controlled tone she always used in socially uncomfortable situations. "This is absurd. Harold trusted Vincent implicitly when it came to financial matters. Just as he trusted me with academic and cultural matters," I added, speaking for the first time since the initial greetings. Yet I was mysteriously excluded from his final will, despite years of explicit statements regarding his intentions. Then came the crucial moment. Thomas slid another folder across the table, containing the draft will we had discovered among my father's documents, clearly dated after the one that had been officially presented. This draft, prepared just 5 weeks before Harold Mitchell's death, tells a very different story about his final intentions, Thomas explained. "You'll notice it specifically names Miss Audrey Mitchell as the primary beneficiary of 40% of the estate, consistent with Mr. Mitchell's earlier statements regarding his succession plans." Hargrove examined the document with growing unease. An unsigned draft hardly overrides a properly executed will. On its own, perhaps not, Thomas agreed. But combined with evidence of medical incapacity during the supposed execution of the official will, suspicious financial transfers, and, more significantly, conclusive proof of false claims made to delegitimize Miss Mitchell, it forms a substantial basis for formal contestation and potentially a criminal investigation. "False claims?" Catherine repeated, her tone calculatedly perplexed. "I don't know what you're referring to. It was my moment. I'm referring, Mother, to your claim that I was adopted and therefore had no legitimate claim to the Mitchell inheritance. Darling, I only shared the truth your father." "I took a DNA test," I interrupted, my voice calm but firm. "The results are conclusive. I am unquestionably the biological daughter of Harold Mitchell, not adopted, as you claimed." The silence that followed was profound. Vincent studied the pattern of the Persian rug with sudden intensity. Catherine seemed momentarily speechless, something I had never witnessed before. "Audrey," she finally managed, "there must be some mistake with the test." "In fact, the test was conducted 3 times to ensure accuracy," I replied, "and it revealed something even more significant." I paused deliberately, watching Catherine's face. After 3 decades together, I knew every nuance of her expression. What I saw now was something rarely displayed. Genuine fear. The DNA confirms that Harold Mitchell was my biological father, but you, Catherine, are not my biological mother. Vincent looked up abruptly, visibly shocked. His attorney looked completely bewildered. Only Catherine remained composed, the final confirmation that she had always known the truth. "My biological mother is Eleanor Carson," the statement hung in the air like smoke. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Martha, the housekeeper, standing in the doorway, apparently bringing refreshments, now inadvertently witnessing seismic family revelations. "This is absurd," Vincent protested, partially regaining his composure. Eleanor is Dad's sister. Exactly, I confirmed softly. And if we're going to bring the full truth to light, this is a fact Catherine has known from the very beginning. There was no adoption, only an elaborate arrangement to conceal a relationship society would not have accepted, allowing you, I turned to Catherine, to preserve social status and financial security in exchange for raising your husband's biological child with another woman as your own. The full revelation had precisely the impact Thomas and I had anticipated. The lawyers exchanged alarmed glances, clearly calculating the complex legal implications. Vincent looked genuinely stunned. It seemed he had not known this part of the family's story. Catherine, however, quickly regained her composure. If this is true, and I'm not admitting that it is, then your legal position is even more precarious, Audrey. A court would hardly recognize inheritance rights for a child born of such a relationship. You're absolutely right, I agreed, catching her off guard. A public legal battle would expose painful family secrets, potentially undermine my legitimacy as an heir, and certainly generate sensational headlines that would harm all of us. Thomas stepped in again, his calm tone conveying the strength of our position. That is precisely why we've prepared an alternative proposal, a private agreement that redistributes the estate in a manner more aligned with Harold Mitchell's original intentions, confirmed by multiple witnesses and documentation, while preserving family discretion. He opened another folder, revealing meticulously prepared documents. This agreement proposes dividing the estate into thirds, 1/3 to Audrey, 1/3 to Vincent, and the final third split between Catherine and the charitable institutions Harold Mitchell always supported. And if we refuse? Vincent's lawyer asked, finally finding his voice. Then we'll proceed with a formal challenge to the current will, including a request for an investigation into the suspicious financial transfers, Thomas replied. A process that would inevitably make public all the details we've just discussed. The silence that followed was profound as the implications sank in completely. Finally, Catherine made direct eye contact with me, something rare in our often distant relationship. Would you really do that? Publicly expose your father and Eleanor like this? I'd rather not, I answered honestly. I don't want to destroy reputations or cause unnecessary pain. I just want what my father clearly intended. For me to be recognized as a legitimate part of this family and his legacy. After another exchanged glance between Catherine and Vincent, their defenses finally began to crumble. 1 week after the confrontation in the library, we met again to finalize the agreement. The atmosphere had noticeably shifted, combativeness replaced by pragmatism. The lawyers now dominated the conversation, discussing the fine points of percentage distributions and transfer schedules, as if the seismic revelations of the previous week were nothing more than standard contractual details. Catherine remained. Exceptionally quiet, her usual social control replaced by a kind of introspection I had never seen in her before. Vincent, on the other hand, had adapted to the situation with surprising ease, the mark of a true businessman, prioritizing practical outcomes over wounded pride. With these documents signed, Thomas concluded as the final pages were passed. Around for signatures. The estate of Harold Mitchell will be officially redistributed as agreed, without the need for public court proceedings. I watched my own signature join the others on the document, a simple gesture that formalized both reconciliation and the acknowledgement of a long-suppressed truth. The outcome wasn't a victory or a defeat, but something more complex, a compromise, that honored original intentions while avoiding unnecessary destruction. At the end of the meeting, Catherine discreetly indicated she wanted to speak with me privately. We walked to the solarium, the one space in the mansion that had remained relatively unchanged since my childhood, its glass walls framing the meticulously kept garden beyond. "You look like him," she said after a few moments of contemplative silence. "Not just physically, but in your determination. Harold always admired that, you know?" Her comment surprised me. Not because of what she said, but because it lacked the resentment I had always sensed when she made similar comparisons in the past. "Why the lie about the adoption?" I asked directly. "After all these years, why that specific story?" Catherine instinctively adjusted a nearby floral arrangement before answering. "Panic, mostly. When Harold died, I realized my position was fragile. The spending habits I'd developed, they wouldn't be sustainable with just my share of the original will. So you decided to eliminate my share entirely. It was Vincent who suggested the adoption story, she admitted. He argued it would be more easily accepted than challenging the previous will outright. A lie that would conveniently explain your absence from the new arrangements. There was a strange sense of release in finally hearing the truth spoken plainly, without pretense or evasion. You knew from the beginning, about Eleanor, I mean. Catherine nodded slowly. It was part of the original arrangement. I wanted social standing, security. Harold needed a socially acceptable wife to raise his daughter without inconvenient questions. A practical solution for everyone involved. Except Eleanor, I noted. And maybe me. A flicker of something resembling guilt briefly crossed her face. You were loved, Audrey. Not by me, I admit. I was never maternal by nature, but by Harold, unquestionably, and by Eleanor deeply, even if from a distance. That confession, the frank admission of her inability to connect maternally, was perhaps the most honest moment we had ever shared. What happens now? I asked. Between us? I suppose that depends on you, she replied with her characteristic pragmatism. I don't expect sudden filial affection, nor will I offer false maternal devotion. But perhaps we can build something more authentic than the facade we've maintained for decades. This offer of late-stage honesty, however limited, represented a potential foundation for a redefined relationship, not as mother and daughter, roles we never truly occupied, but as two adult women connected by shared history, finally acknowledging long-suppressed truths. In the days that followed, we began the complicated process of rebuilding. One afternoon, I visited Eleanor at her country home, now with a completely transformed understanding of our bond. I always wanted to tell you, she confessed, silent tears falling freely as we walked through the garden. Especially during the big moments, your first day of school, graduation, academic achievements. I kept a secret journal for you, recording everything I longed to say as a mother, but couldn't. She revealed the journal, leather-bound volume spanning 3 decades, a chronicle of restrained maternal love, watching from afar. The intimacy and vulnerability of those pages built a bridge across the chasm of secrets that had kept us apart. I never wanted you to find out this way, she added. Your father and I had planned to tell you the truth together, when the time felt right. Did he really plan to secure my share of the inheritance? Absolutely, Eleanor confirmed. Not just out of duty, but because he genuinely admired the woman you've become. Independent, intellectual, guided by principles beyond financial gain. Vincent, surprisingly, sought reconciliation in his own way. An awkward lunch in neutral territory, a quiet downtown restaurant, provided an opportunity for a refreshingly candid conversation. I didn't know about Eleanor, he admitted, fiddling absent-mindedly with his platinum cufflink. I only knew fragments, that there were complications about your legitimacy that Dad wanted to protect. And the financial transfers? A resigned sigh. Dad did approve some of them initially. When his condition worsened, I continued as if I had ongoing permission. I rationalized it as an advance on my inheritance, not theft. A meaningful pause. Not my most ethical moment. And you convinced Catherine to go along with the adoption lie. I pitched it as a clean solution for everyone. She'd keep her lifestyle, I'd maximize my share, and you'd continue comfortably as a university professor. He gave a slight shrug. We didn't anticipate your determination or resources. You underestimated Harold Mitchell's daughter, I noted, allowing a faint, ironic smile. A rare moment of shared humor pointed to a possibility, not of genuine sibling closeness, but of a reluctant mutual respect that might, eventually, evolve into something more meaningful. The Mitchell estate, per my suggestion included in the final agreement, underwent a significant transformation. Part of the space was repurposed as the headquarters of the newly established Mitchell Educational Foundation, dedicated to providing college scholarships for low-income students, honoring both Harold's passion for education and my own academic career. During the renovations, I accidentally discovered a hidden compartment in my father's study, containing a personal journal he had kept during his final months. His last reflections revealed a man deeply conflicted about past choices, yet determined to eventually acknowledge long-buried truths. "I built a business empire on calculation and strategy," he wrote in increasingly unsteady handwriting, "but I failed in the most important architecture: family honesty." Audrey deserves to know her true origins, not because of any legal obligation, but because the truth, however painful, is the most valuable inheritance I can leave behind. This confirmation of his intentions brought a kind of validation that even the legal agreement had never fully provided. It wasn't just about financial distribution. It was an acknowledgement of my fundamental right to the truth about my identity. 6 months after that confrontation in the library, I organized a dinner bringing together all the key figures: Catherine, Vincent, Eleanor, and myself. It wasn't exactly a celebration, but a recognition of a new shared reality, now grounded in truth instead of a carefully maintained illusion. The conversation flowed surprisingly naturally, decades of tension partially dissolved by the simple relief of no longer having to keep secrets. Eleanor and Catherine interacted with a civility that occasionally revealed flickers of mutual understanding, women who had shared a complex history. Vincent showed flashes of the intelligence my father had always valued, when it wasn't clouded by unchecked ambition. As I watched this improvised family arrangement, unconventional by any standard, full of complications, no family manual could ever address, I realized I had finally found the answer to the question that had haunted me since that first shocking revelation. Who am I really? I wasn't simply Harold's daughter, or Eleanor's, or even the product of the carefully crafted social arrangement Catherine had overseen. I was a unique synthesis of these conflicting influences: Harold's pragmatic determination, Eleanor's artistic sensitivity, even Catherine's social adaptability. Each element had contributed to the person I had become, regardless of the extraordinary circumstances of my origin. The true inheritance I discovered wasn't measured in bank accounts or properties, but in self-knowledge, something no one could forge or manipulate. When my mother said I was adopted to distance me from the family inheritance, she could never have predicted that the DNA test would reveal not only her lies, but a path to a far more valuable truth. The understanding that real family isn't defined by appearances or conventional expectations, but by the courage to finally embrace the truth, no matter how complicated it may be. A few weeks later, during a quiet afternoon sorting through old photographs with Eleanor, now openly acknowledged as my biological mother, we found an image that perfectly captured the strange duality of my childhood. I was 5 years old, holding the hands of both Catherine and Eleanor in the family garden, with Harold proudly watching in the background. 4 people connected by a shared secret, each playing a carefully assigned role in the elaborate production we had called family life. "I always looked for you in crowds," Eleanor confessed, gently stroking the photograph. "At your school plays, sitting quietly in the back. At your graduations, clapping along with the other parents, always so close and impossibly far away." "We're here now," I replied, covering her hand with mine. Maybe late, but not too late. And in that simple moment of connection, I understood that some inheritances transcend wills and property. They persist in the bonds that, though temporarily distorted by secrets, eventually find their way to truth and, with it, the possibility of genuine love without masks or pretense.